Hi all, this is your Professor Ian. This is a video lecture on heroes in Greek myth. So this week we're turning from the Olympian gods, and we're going to be considering some of the biggest heroes in Greek myth. We're going to concentrate on the big four: Theseus, Perseus, Jason, and Heracles. There are many other heroes, but these are, I would say, the most important, the ones with the most stories about them and such. So these are the ones we're going to look at this week. So I have a brief lecture on the heroes and then another lecture on the heroines. So let's start by thinking about the heroes in Greek myth. And this is, of course, a painting of Heracles defeating the snakes that were sent to kill him while he was still an infant. So what we want to think about here are the patterns in these stories, because we've been talking about this idea of syncretism, right? So like the borrowing of different traditions, intellectual and mythological traditions in Greek myth. And so we see a lot of that in the stories of the heroes, because there are tons of stories about Heracles, tons of stories about Theseus, Perseus, even Jason, that don't seem to really, it seems like they're going on side quests and side adventures all the time, all these different stories. And, a lot of historians and scholars think that, Heracles is a figure who kind of stole other people's stories. So if a regional hero had a bunch of stories about him, Heracles kind of absorbed that when he became more important for Greek mythology, right? So that's part of the reason why we see, scholars think that we see such a wide variety of stories about these different heroes. Same with the gods. But then we can look for patterns in these heroes, right? And that's what we want to think about when we're thinking about the role they had in Greek mythology and Greek society, right? Why were these four heroes talked about a lot, especially? So some of the hero checklist, most of them are secret children of God, right? There's some kind of holy lineage. They survive the childhood obstacles, like Heracles and the snakes. There's oracles speaking about their fates. There's prophecies, right? They are equipped or trained by the gods, right? Heracles is trained by the centaur, the centaur mentor. That's a good rhyme. There are, of course, a series of exploits that involve violence and battle, right? This is Greek myth, so of course there are these like battles with monsters and such. And also important, these exploits, these adventures they have allow for individual victory, right? It's not that Heracles leads an army to victory against another army, right? Even Jason, who leads the Argonauts, right? It's still a story primarily about Jason, and he's the one who takes on the dragon at the end. Individual victory is very important. I'm going to be talking about this in a minute, introducing some terms. They kill a monster that threatens the order of humankind, right? So there's also always this idea of the hero as the avatar of civilization taking on the inhuman monster, right? Medusa, Nemean lion, right, et cetera, the Minotaur, right? These bestial, inhuman representations of chaos and the other, right? So they always defeat these in the name of civilization. This also involves travels to the edge of the known world. Often this also includes travels to the underworld, right? Many of the big Greek heroes are chthonic. You might see that term coming up. It just means subterranean, but it means like underground. So Hades is a chthonic god, but most of these heroes also have a kind of chthonic element to them. They journey to the underworld, and that is, of course, super rare, and it's a huge feat for a human to do that, or even a demigod, like a half god, half god, half mortal figure. And also, one of the most important things is the return home, right? A heroic journey is incomplete without the return home with the new knowledge and abilities to better society, right? The founding of a community and dynasty. These are integral to this storytelling, to the victory of a hero. If they don't return home as a victorious hero, they don't really win, right? So that's the hero's checklist. This is coming from the work of Joseph Campbell. You might have heard this name. He wrote a bunch of books, but probably the most influential is called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. He wrote this back the mid last century. A juicy quote from that is a hero, and he's defining what he called this the monomyth, right? So mono just means one, myth, story, right? So he had this idea that all myth and story kind of follows one pattern, one essential pattern, and he called that the monomyth, and he defined it, or he kind of like gave the details as such. A hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered, and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. Right? So again, this going forth from the commonplace to the supernatural to the underworld, sometimes, often decisive encounters, coming back with gifts. This is just an illustration of an artist's idea of representing this hero's journey. If you're interested, you can read the book. He gets into much more detail about Joseph Campbell was uh, into narratology and structuralism, so he's very much about breaking down the different parts of a narrative, so you can really get into the different steps as he saw it that go into any kind of hero's journey. So that's where some of these terms come from that we use to discuss, especially the heroes in Greek myth and Greek myth in general. There will be a bonus assignment about Joseph Campbell if you want to learn some more about this influential figure. There's also a lot of critiques about Joseph Campbell because it's a very gendered reading of myth and story, and it does ignore a lot of inconvenient details. Right? If you look at a lot of Norse mythology, there's crazy stuff going on there with gender and sexuality in some of the myths that people like Joseph Campbell tend to ignore when they're looking at when they're defining what a myth is. Right? It's a very masculine, male-centered view of mythology. But let's move on. Let's think about the role of Greek heroes in Greek society. Right? You remember Hesiod's 5 ages, right? There's this kind of like falling away from God and falling away from heroism involved in this. So there's a looking back at the victories of yesteryear. So you can see that very much, it's about venerating heroes when he's talking about the 5 ages, right? These great, men, as he's talking about, these great men that we will never equal again. They embodied the best of us, right? They were the patriarchs and the matriarchs of the best lineage of humankind. They're also the justification of existing political order, right? We get into the, Theseus and the Minotaur. That's very much can be read very much as like a political story of Athens overcoming, the Cretan, the Cretan kingdom, right, and establishing their own order in the face of this injustice of the Minotaur or whatnot. And justifying that political order of Athens, right? Kind of founding that political order. They're also the embodiment of moral norms, right? Again, the best of us. This heroism that they establish. They defeat monsters in the name of civilization, right? And yet, but it's also interesting in Greek mythology because they are the embodiment of moral norms, and yet they're super complicated figures, right? Heracles can be a real jerk in some of the stories. So can Perseus and Jason. They're not always nice people, right? Jason does some bad things to Medea towards the end of it. Theseus is maybe the least compromised, but even he has some stories about him that are less favorable, right? But at the same time, they are very much the way that Greek people would have talked about heroism and martial victory and things like this. And they've been important figures for centuries afterwards in European art and European culture to embody these kinds of standards and what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it, but moral norms is coming back to it. And in case this sounds, unlikely to you, or you can't see why anybody would venerate Heracles in such a way, think about the way we talk about heroes in our own society. Abraham Lincoln. This is from. I live in Redlands, so this is downtown in Redlands. There's a Abraham Lincoln shrine. It's actually called a shrine, and it's got all this, it's stuff. And inside, it's all about. It's like a Civil War museum, mostly dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, very much in his memory. Right, he's this great hero from American past. And, this is a super topical thing to think about too, with like all the statues being pulled down right now. How do we remember these figures from our past, right? We're having this debate right now in our society, but this is nothing. This isn't what the point I'm trying to make is. This is not unique to Greek culture, right? The way they thought about heroes and venerated them. There were cults of to Heracles, less so to the other heroes that we're talking about this week, but they still had followers and people who loved them and such, and venerated them as the greatest heroes. And we have the same thing happening in our society, and the same debates going on about how we embody what we think is the best in humanity, right? And it differs by society to society, right? So Abraham Lincoln is generally a pretty safe hero for our society because he's this great peacemaker. He freed the slaves. He's the great emancipator, right? Whereas obviously Robert E. Lee has very different connotations, right? Even though they're both military leaders during the same conflict, right? Abraham Lincoln is a much more universally accepted hero, right? I also wanted to finish this lecture with introducing two terms. One is Cleos. This is something we're going to see again. These terms are going to come into play more and more as we get into the Iliad and the Odyssey. We're going to we're going to learn some more terms too. I like to introduce them slowly so I don't overload you with Greek terms. But Cleos, this is the glory a hero receives after death when he or she is remembered, right? So it's that glory. And an important part of Greek culture is being remembered after death. Because remember, especially in earlier Greek culture, it changes a bit as Greek culture spreads and takes on more elements of other Near Eastern cultures. But especially early Greek mythology and culture, there wasn't a very favorable view of the afterworld. Greek, people didn't look forward to this heaven where you're sitting beside Zeus or whatnot. So instead, the idea was that you would be honored by your living relatives or honored by other people who knew your renown after you died, right? So this can take the form of all kinds of things, as I note here: a dynasty, a continuing line of descendants. And remember, Greece was very much a musical, poetry-based. That was their culture was music and poetry based. So songs and poetry about someone would be a way of providing Cleos for that person, of achieving Cleos. There were athletic contests, right? The Olympic Games. There were all kinds of different games around Greece, and usually, well, they would always be played in the honor of specific people. So great athletes, great warriors would be honored by these games, religious rituals, right? So anything that honors this fallen hero, this dead hero, would be a way of conferring Cleos upon this figure, right? And as we're going to see in the Iliad, Achilles has this. He's faced with the choice between glory, Cleos, or going home and living a long life, right? He knows that he's going to die if he stays at Troy, but he says to his friends, my mother tells me, and his mother tells him this prophecy that he's going to die if he stays, tells me that there are two ways in which I will meet my end. If I stay here and fight, I shall not have a return alive of my glory, my Cleos, will be imperishable. Whereas if I go home, my name, my Cleos, right, we translate it multiple ways, will perish. But it will be long before the end shall take me. Right? So if he goes home, he'll be obscure and die without being remembered. If he stays, he's going to die young, but he'll be remembered forever. And, spoiler alert, he decides to stay because it's that important to Greek warriors. The other term I want to introduce right now is called eidos, and that's the shame. And this is the opposite of Cleos, right? So if you fail in battle or you're embarrassed in battle, that's the worst fate that could befall a warrior, right? And I've got a couple quotes here from various scholars about this idea of eidos, right? Just remember, it's the opposite of Cleos. Cleos is that glory that the warrior can win in battle, whereas eidos is that shame, right? So if you ran from an enemy, as we see at the end of the Iliad when Hector runs from Achilles, right? If he were to survive that battle, he would be shamed forever, right? And his family would live with that shame, right? So your reputation as a warrior was everything. Cleos and eidos were these two opposite sides of that coin. Okay, so the rest of these slides, I go through the big four heroes, right? So I won't bore you by going through those, as you have the readings this week to learn about those on your own. Okay, so thank you very much, and have Have a good week.